Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Lots of challenges for the government now. With Brexit talks starting tomorrow, I'm joined by the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. But before we get to that, let's talk about the aftermath of this fire. After the Lakanal house fire in South London, there was a coroner's inquest. And 4 years ago, the coroner said that the building regulations relating to fire safety had to be looked at again. Has that happened?
Can I just start by offering my condolences to those who've lost family, friends, loved ones in this terrible tragedy, and extending my sympathy to all those in the community who are affected. This is the first time I've been on the media since the fire, so I just want to put that on record. Look, we've looked, obviously, at those recommendations and what's happened to them. My assessment is that we have responded correctly and appropriately to those recommendations. But Andrew,
let me just finish. Have you revised those regulations?
It's no good getting a government minister on here and asking me to mark our own homework. The point of having a public inquiry is precisely that a judge will look at those recommendations. He will look at how the government has responded, how landlords have responded, how local authorities have responded, and it will be for the public inquiry to decide definitively whether that has been correctly done or not.
But you are accountable to everybody watching and to the public generally for what the government has done.
Yes, of course.
The government has had 4 years to look again at fire regulations, which you were told by a coroner after a ghastly fire in which 6 people were killed in South London, you had to revise. I put it to you, you have not revised those regulations, and that is a major, major error by this government.
Well, there's a process underway, and the various steps have been taken. Research has been commissioned, which was reported back on. As I understand it, there was a consultation published earlier this year on revision to regulations. Now,
sorry,
it will be
a public, there's been consultation, there's been revisions, there's been hawing and humming, and there's been this and there's that. You've had 4 years to do something you were told needed to be done, and you haven't done it. You'd have done it within 5 minutes if it had been in Buckingham Palace. With these tower blocks, you have sat on this for 4 years.
No, I don't think that's true, and it's not fair. I think the point is these are very complex technical issues, and in this case, technical expert research was commissioned so that the decisions could be properly informed. Now, did it take too long? Did we handle it in the correct way?
Yes. No, surely.
Well, the inquiry will determine that. That's the point of having a judge-led public inquiry with full power to call anyone to give evidence, to call for all papers. That will put all of this stuff under the microscope and show how different parties responded. And all of that should be looked at. Of course it should.
Well, let's turn to another absolutely irrelevant question, which is that of sprinklers in this building. Again, you were told to advise local authorities to put in sprinklers. Sprinklers are not in many of these buildings. They're not apparently in most of our new schools either. Do you not need an urgent campaign, whatever the cost, to put sprinklers into tower blocks, schools and other public buildings?
Well, if the conclusion of a proper technical evaluation is that that is the best way to deal with the problem, then of course. But my understanding, Andrew, and again, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that the best expert advice is that retrofitting sprinklers may not always be the best technical way of ensuring fire safety in a building. Now, if it is, it should be done.
Well,
but let's get the technical advice properly evaluated by public inquiry, and then let's decide how to go forward. But let's be clear.
I'm sorry,
if there's something that needs to be done to make buildings safe, it will be done.
Can I put it to you that I'm not an expert either, that we don't actually need technical expertise to tell us that sprinklers help put out fires, and that a lot of people sitting in blocks like that one will be watching this programme thinking there are no sprinklers outside my staircase, why not? We don't need technical expertise. The Fire Brigades Union has pointed out that there has never been a case of anyone losing their life in a fire in this country where sprinklers have been fitted.
Well, these are technical questions. Let's
leave
it to think. Well, I am
sprinklers put out fires.
So I've been in these meetings. Of course, we've asked all these questions. Of course, we've asked all these questions. What I'm hearing from the leading fire safety experts is that it isn't necessarily necessary to fit retrofit sprinklers to make a building fire safe. Now, I don't want to call that judgment because I'm not an expert, but I do think we need to look through the public inquiry at all the evidence for this, all the technical evidence. The commitment that government should make, and I'll make it now, is that when the inquiry produces its findings, and I don't mean in years' time, because we're going to ask them to produce interim findings, when the inquiry produces findings, we will act on them.
The cladding that was used around this tower, which went up like a rocket, is banned across most European countries. It's banned in the United States. If the inquiry says it's got to be banned in this country and it's got to be torn off every single building that's got it and we have to reclad those buildings whatever the cost, will the government pick up the tab for that too?
Well, again, my understanding is that the cladding in question, this flammable cladding,
Yes,
which is banned in Europe and the US, is also banned here. That's my understanding.
So why did it go up?
Well, so the question, there are two separate questions. One is, are our regulations correct? Do they permit the right kind of materials and ban the wrong kind of materials? Second question is, were they correctly complied with? And obviously that will be a subject that the inquiry will look at. It will also be a subject that the separate criminal investigation will be looking at.
Was David Cameron, your former leader, right to say that it was important to kill off the health and safety culture in this country?
Well, he wasn't talking about fire safety and that kind of thing.
Well, he said health and safety.
Fire safety in buildings is absolutely crucial, and nobody would compromise anything around fire safety of buildings.
Well, there was a debate in the House of Commons on sprinklers and fire safety not that long ago, and Brandon Lewis, one of your ministers at the time, again and again boasted about getting rid of regulations. You know, get rid of one regulation, get rid of two regulations, and the whole conversation was about getting rid of regulations and the excessive cost of sprinklers.
Well, getting rid of regulation in order to do regulation properly, smart regulation, effective regulation. We did have a jungle of legacy regulations in this country, and I think we should be proud of the way we cleared out a lot of the unnecessary regulation to make life easier, particularly for small businesses. But nobody wants to compromise on critical safety regulations. That's not the case at all.
OK, last year there was a vote in the House of Commons to ensure that all private landlords, not the ones here, private landlords ensure their homes were fit for human habitation. How did you vote?
I think that was a private member's bill. I don't think I voted on it, but
it was an amendment to the Housing and Planning Bill.
OK. Well, I can't answer your question.
You voted against it.
It'll be a matter of record.
You voted against it, and my point is that your political critics say that the Conservatives have launched this war against the so-called health and safety culture, sneering at it at every possible opportunity. Regulation's always bad, and you have pushed far too far.
No, regulation isn't always bad. Good regulation is what we need, and we have a proper regulatory framework. Now, obviously, there are questions about it, and it's right that the public inquiry should look at those questions. But it's not the right way to run a regulatory framework just to accept amendments that people table to try and change it in this way.
Fit for human habitation seems all right, isn't it?
Well, we have a framework that makes sure that buildings are safe and fit for habitation. What we have to do is make sure that framework is right, and then also make sure that it is being enforced and implemented in the correct way. And these are legitimate questions, of course they are, in the event of a terrible tragedy like this. We must look at those things, and the right way to do it is to ask an independent judge to look at them. The
general election gives us a new situation, obviously, in the House of Commons and so forth. Are you going to go ahead with your £30 billion cuts to local authority budgets?
Well, we've...
3 billion, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, that's...
3 billion cuts.
3 billion, right.
With the BBC, we always multiply by 10.
Yeah, I noticed that. Look, we've set out a series of measures that are already legislated for. We've got other proposals that we will now have to look at again in the light of the general election result and in the new Parliament. I will be delivering a budget in the autumn, and you'll find out then what we're proposing in that budget. But
you're not saying that these £3 billion cuts in local authority spending is definitely going to go ahead now?
Well, what I'm saying to you is there's not going to be a sort of summer budget or anything like that. There will be a regular budget in November, as we had always planned, and in that budget we will set out our future plans for public spending, for taxation, for fiscal balance and everything else that needs to be clear.
Because I put it to you, particularly if you're dependent upon the DUP, who are against the cuts to the winter fuel payment, are against some of the things you've talked about on the triple lock and so forth, and by and large are against deep welfare cuts, that actually the general direction of policy is going to have to change.
Well, we'll look at all these things. Obviously, we're not deaf. We heard a message last week in the general election, and we need to look at how we deal with the challenges that we face in the economy. And I understand that people are weary after years of hard work to rebuild the economy from the great crash of 2008, 2009. But we have to live within our means. And more borrowing, which seems to be Jeremy Corbyn's answer, is not the solution. Borrowing to fund current consumption is simply asking the next generation to pick up the tab for spending that we want to do but aren't prepared to pay for. But
you'd agree with Tobias Ellwood. You've almost used the same words. He said the nation has been worn down by austerity. There is no doubt about it.
Well, I think people are weary of the long slog. I remember what damage was done. Our economy contracted by nearly 7% after the financial crisis during that recession. And it's been a very long process of rebuilding. But look what we've achieved. We created 2.9 million new jobs during that period. We've had a growth rate nearly double France's over that period and higher than Germany's. Those are remarkable achievements.
That's the record. That is the history.
Yes.
Looking forward, are you prepared to say that we are going to take a different direction and that the version of austerity that the country has gone through over the last period, which has produced the results you said, is now over and you're taking a different direction?
Well, look, I took a different direction when I took this job last year. I changed my predecessor's targets and pushed out the date when we will deliver fiscal balance, giving us more fiscal headroom, recognising that we were going through a period of uncertainty because of the Brexit negotiations. So I have created a lot more flexibility to respond to the situation on the ground in the economy, and we'll use that if necessary.
And you've been very clear about saying you're against further borrowing. You've been clear about saying you're listening to what the country feels about austerity. That would imply that under certain circumstances you'd be prepared to raise some taxes a bit to blunt the edge of austerity.
Well, we've never said we won't raise some taxes. Overall, we are a government that believes in low taxes, and we want to reduce the burden of taxes overall for working families. That is our political objective. But what is dishonest is the approach the Labour Party took in the general election.
Well, let's put them to one side just for a second.
Pretending that you can raise taxes, but they will never impact ordinary people. I'm afraid increasing the burden of taxation will have an impact. If it's tax on companies, it will reduce investment and the creation of jobs.
Point taken, but some people will listen to what you've just been saying and put a headline on that saying austerity is over, says Philip Hammond.
Well, I've seen lots of headlines saying that already. Look, the issue
Would you cheer with that one?
The issue is that we've still got a deficit. We've given, and it's 2.5% of our GDP. That's not sustainable in the long term. Nobody can spend 2.5% more than they earn every year. We have to deal with that. We've stretched out the timetable for dealing with it to give ourselves a bit more room to support the economy during this period. But our objective
and you have leeway on the fiscal side as well, don't you?
Remains to bring the public finances back to balance by the middle of the next decade. To do that in a way that is sensitive to the needs of the economy, and that's why we deliberately created what you've called the wriggle room during the next few years on the fiscal side. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. How do you think that Britain's position when it comes to the Brexit negotiations has been changed by the election result?
Well, our position has been set out in the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech. That was generally well received in the European Union. Of course, we're going into a negotiation. It's not surprising that there's been a bit of posturing and chest beating coming from Brussels. We'd expect that. But what I hear, and I was in Luxembourg at the ECOFIN meeting on Friday, what I hear from my colleagues is a remaining commitment, a continuing commitment to engage constructively with the UK and a desire to have a close, ongoing relationship with the UK, and that's good news.
But to those in the Tory party who call you a Remainer, Phil, can you say we're definitely leaving the EU, absolutely on my watch, and we're definitely leaving the single market on my watch?
Yes.
To both of those?
Definitely. We're leaving the EU, and because we're leaving the EU, we will be leaving the single market. And by the way, we'll be leaving the customs union. The question is not whether we're leaving the customs union. The question is, what do we put in its place in order to deliver the objectives which the Prime Minister set out in the Lancaster House speech of having no hard land border in Ireland, and enabling British goods to flow freely backwards and forwards across the border with the European Union.
And you know that a lot of business in the city and elsewhere across British business is really, really worried about this issue,
yes,
and fears a sharp cliff edge.
Yes, and that is the issue. When I talk about a Brexit that supports British jobs, British investment, British business, I mean a Brexit that avoids those cliff edges, that ensures that we segue seamlessly from the customs union that we're in at the moment to a new arrangement in the future that will continue to allow British goods to flow, not just without tariffs, because actually tariffs are a relatively small part of the problem. It's without delays and bureaucracy. It's the delay and bureaucracy interfering with just-in-time supply chains, with the flow of fresh produce. We import huge amounts of fresh produce from the European Union. We've got to make sure that our border continues to work seamlessly, and that's probably the #1 challenge for business.
Now, you've said a different model, but this also implies quite a long, possibly transitional arrangement before we actually leave the customs union. Is that right?
Well, I've always said we will need, and Lancaster House speech makes clear that we will need some kind of transitional structures, and the European Union needs to understand that as well. This is not a British ask or a British demand. It's a statement of common sense that if we're going to radically change the way we work together, we need to get there via a slope, not via a cliff edge. That's good for business on both sides of the English Channel. It's good for citizens. It's good for protecting jobs.
Would you expect that we had left the customs union by the end of this Parliament, that is in 2022?
Well, look, we will leave the customs union when we leave the European Union. That's a statement of legal fact. The question is what we put in place, and what we put in place may not be a single arrangement that endures forever. It may be an arrangement which lasts for a couple of years as a temporary measure before we get to the long-term agreed status quo for relations between the UK and the European Union. But this is all a subject of negotiation.
During those couple of years, if that's how long it takes, Liam Fox is hopping from foot to foot, desperate, bursting to get out there and do his new trade deals around the world. And he can't do it while we're still tied to the customs union, can he?
Well, look, it depends. If we're restricted on being able to enter into new free trade deals with third countries during an interim period, that won't stop us negotiating and preparing. Normally these deals take quite a long time to negotiate. It also won't stop us in any way from negotiating deals around services, particularly financial services, an area where the UK has got a huge
Are you worried
advantage.
about the position of the city?
We're allowed to do that. Even now, as members of the customs union, we can do that.
Are you worried about the position of the city right now?
Well, obviously, the city, the financial services sector, by the way, the majority of which is not in the city, it's spread around the country. But it's a very important part of our economy, about 7% of our economy. It's an even more important part of our fiscal receipts. About 11% of our taxes come from the financial services sector, so very important we protect that. And because we've got an economy which is heavily services dominated, it's essential for us, for Britain, that a future deal with the European Union is not just about free trade in goods, but also about free trade in services. It's got to be fair, and it will only be fair if it deals with services as well as goods.
Do you think that no deal's better than a bad deal?
Let me be clear that no deal would be a very, very bad outcome for Britain. But there is a possible worse outcome, and that is a deal that is deliberately structured to punish us, to suck the lifeblood out of our economy over a period of time. And I would not agree to a deal that was clearly structured and designed to destroy us by slow bites over a long period of time. That's not acceptable.
And you're in charge of the money. Do you look at some of those eye-watering sums being talked about in the EU as the price for leaving and say, absolutely not on my watch?
Well, I look at most of them and say I don't recognise these sums at all. I think this is the most egregious pre-negotiation posturing that I've seen for a very long while. But any questions around money, financial contributions to any organisations or structures will be for the negotiations, which will start tomorrow.
Do you think in the aftermath of the election vote, the tens of thousands promised on immigration is now dead?
Well, the Prime Minister's been clear that we will aspire to deliver, over time, sustainable net migration into this country, and that's defined as being below 100,000 per year. But we haven't put a timescale on it. We know it's going to be challenging, and we have been very clear that we're not going to do it in a way that damages the British economy.
Okay.
So it's got to go hand in hand, in tandem, with addressing our skills shortage here, and we've taken a big step forward with the announcements on technical skills in the budget.
Right.
First, we home grow the skills we need, and then we deal with migration issues.
When you saw the exit poll on election night, it must have been a bittersweet moment. You knew you probably lost your overall majority, but you knew you were going to keep your job, because if Theresa May had got a big majority, she'd have fired you as Chancellor.
You're much too Machiavellian, Andrew. My reaction was bitter, nothing sweet about it. I was shocked, as I think everybody else was. That wasn't the feeling that I had got from travelling round the entire
Right.
country over the election
We
period.
didn't see much of you during the election campaign, and as I said, the Prime Minister was planning to sack you, apparently. Did you have a conversation with her when you said, well, I'm still here, are you going to get rid of me? What did you say to her?
Well, I'm not going to repeat to you the private conversation that I had with Theresa May on Friday. Yet it's true that my role in the election campaign was not the one I would have liked it to be. I did a lot of travelling around the country.
Do you think?
I met lots of very interesting people. I heard lots of interesting stories. Look, I would have liked to have made much more of our economic record, which I think is an excellent one, creating 2.9 million new jobs, getting the deficit down by 3/4.
Was this Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill keeping you off the airwaves?
Well, I'm not going to speculate about what happened inside the campaign leadership team. The end result is that, in my judgment, we didn't talk about the economy as much as we should have done. We didn't.
And do you think Theresa May recognises that was a mistake now?
We didn't put enough energy into dismantling Jeremy Corbyn's economic proposals and his spending plans, which would be catastrophic for this country. And we will now do that. We will now address those plans that Corbyn set out in his manifesto and take them apart, which I would have liked to have done during the campaign.
Very often described as a terrible campaign, since if it had more Philip Hammond in it, more economics, would it have been a better campaign?
Well, I think focusing on our strengths is always the right way to campaign. Economic competence has always been one of the great Conservative strengths, and in this case we have an excellent economic record. I would have liked to have highlighted our economic record, and I think if we had focused on that, we probably would have done better in the election than we did.
One last numerical question. How long has Theresa May got?
Well, I think what the country needs now is a period of calm while we get on with the job in hand. We've got some very serious issues to address, including the Brexit negotiations just starting. Theresa is leading the government, and I think the government needs to get on with its job. And do you know what? I think actually that's what most people in this country will think, that the government just needs to get on with the day job of government.
Philip Hammond, Chancellor, thank you very much indeed.
Now, we always ask our viewers for a question for our interviewee, and this probably won't surprise you that the most common question, and this one, we've got the version put by Chris Lambert, is, where have you been? And why have they let you back out?
Well, if you're referring, I'll assume you're referring to the
fact that during the general election, you were apparently locked in a cupboard by the Prime Minister's two chiefs of staff.
Not quite in a cupboard. I was out and about around the country visiting marginal constituencies, talking to people on the ground, and it was a very interesting experience.
Why weren't you at the front line of the campaign?
Well, because the campaign did not focus on economic issues. It did not focus on our very good economic track record.
That was a mistake, wasn't it? It was a mistake by the Prime Minister not to focus on economics, wasn't it?
I think it was a mistake of the campaign not to focus more on an area where we have a great story to tell, our record on the economy since the Great Recession, rebuilding this economy over the last 7 years. I think it was a mistake that we didn't spend more time and resource taking apart Jeremy Corbyn's economic proposals and his spending plans, which are frankly incredible and would do enormous damage to this country, to our jobs, to our economy. So I think that was a mistake, and I think that if we had focused on those areas, we might have done rather better.
Some would say a bit late to make those arguments now, but to be clear, they were popular and they are widely seen as the British people saying we've had enough of austerity, we need more investment in schools, social care, hospitals. Are you going to give us that investment?
Well, I certainly recognise that people are weary after 7 years of rebuilding the economy from the horrors that we saw after the financial crash.
So you're going to take the straitjacket off?
Nearly 7% reduction in our GDP. Well, look, I changed course last autumn. I moved from my predecessor's plans to have a balanced budget later in this decade. I moved that point forward into effectively the middle of the next decade, giving us more fiscal space.
Does it give you more space to spend now?
It gives us more space to respond to what's happening in the economy. Now,
which is slowing down.
Last year, when I made the autumn statement, the economy was actually performing well. Growth was continuing. The forecasts for this year are also good, growth of 1.8, 1.9, 2%, pick your forecast.
Although the latest data is showing a bit of a slowdown.
The first quarter data showed a much slower start to the year, although there's been a pattern recently of the first quarter being slow, so we need to wait and see what's happening. But the whole point of resetting the fiscal rules was to create a capability to respond if the economy needed fiscal support. So we have that ability. We will obviously look very carefully at what's happening in the economy between now and the autumn budget.
So can I ask a couple of quick questions, because we've got to go into a break, but a couple of quick questions. Will this be an important budget, the one in the autumn? And secondly, can people read into what you're saying that there will be more resource provided for vital public services?
So all budgets are important budgets, Robert, but I want to be clear about this question of how we resource public services. There are only three ways in which we can spend more on our public services. We can tax more, we can borrow more, or we can improve the productive capacity of our economy, increase our productivity. And in the long run,
productivity takes years.
It does.
And people want change now.
It does, but there are no easy routes here. We have to recognise that if we want well-funded public services and high standards of living, we have to improve our productivity. And whatever else we're doing in the short term, that has to be our medium-term strategy. Borrowing, in my view, is simply ducking the question.
Although borrowing is now massively lower than it was, and many economists would say you have got scope to borrow a bit more for a while.
We're still borrowing 2.5% of our GDP. We've got a very large debt, and we are spending more on interest on that debt than we spend on our armed forces and our police services.
Most people would say 2.5% is a sustainable level.
Well, I'm not sure that most economists would say that, given the level of our debt. We're at 87% debt to GDP ratio. That's very high.
We'll come back. We'll pick up more of this in just a minute. Slightly to my surprise, the Prime Minister's people haven't pulled Philip Hammond from the set. He's still with me, but first, Allegra.
Well, people out there are reacting to the revelation from our earlier guest, Nisha Party. She was out at the Westway coordinating the response to the Grenfell fire, and she told us earlier that people have been given just a tenner to try and get their life back on track. Here, a viewer, he says, Kensington Chelsea Council have a massive cash reserve due to savings, quote-unquote. Why can't they use some of that to help Grenfell victims? And then a wider point by the journalist Jane Merrick. She says, what happened to accountability? How come 5 days on from one of our country's worst peacetime disasters, no one has resigned or offered to? Robert.
I mean, that is an important point. Some say that confidence in the Prime Minister has evaporated. Do you think she will survive?
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister's focused. We're dealing with the aftermath of a terrible tragedy, and the Prime Minister's focused on the work that needs to be done. She's been chairing meetings of the working group, making sure that the help that's needed is delivered. She acknowledged last night that that hasn't always happened in a way that's quick enough or effective enough for people on the ground. But on the money, I just want to emphasise again, £5 million of cash has been made available through the local authority for distribution. We've now got DWP people working on the ground distributing that money.
Your relationship with her deteriorated. Is it back on track?
The Prime Minister asked me last Friday to join her new government as Chancellor, and I'm delighted to have accepted that offer.
You would have been sacked if she'd got her overwhelming majority.
Well, that's speculation. I think we've got an important job to do, and I'm looking forward to playing an important role in that.
It is, as you say, an important job with Brexit talks starting tomorrow. Now, I know you say that as a matter of definition, when we leave the EU, we obviously leave the single market and the customs union. But do you think we should, like Norway, for example, recontract back into the single market?
Well, I think in an ideal situation, we will do what we've set out in the Lancaster House speech that the Prime Minister gave in January, which was actually very well received in the European Union. We then spelled it out again in our Article 50 letter, that we want to have a very close partnership with the European Union.
Something that feels like the single market and being in the customs union?
Certainly, our objective should be that for a producer of export goods in Nottingham sending their goods to Liège, they should certainly be able to experience a process which feels as close as possible to the way it feels now. We've got to make sure that we don't impede our exporters. That would damage jobs and prosperity in this country.
And you've said jobs and prosperity have to come first. So does that mean that actually some kind of modified free movement for you would be acceptable?
I think the most important thing to protecting jobs and prosperity is to make sure that we don't have a cliff edge. The thing that business fears...
A transition arrangement?
Yeah, we need a transition arrangement. To get from where we are now to whatever future arrangements we agree with the European Union, the most important ask from business, almost more important than what the end result looks like, is that we have a smooth path to get there. Because anything that created a cliff edge in 2019 would be very, very damaging to the UK economy.
So should David Davis tomorrow, in fact, say, let's talk about the transition, let's talk about how many years we're going to effectively be in the single market and customs union until, as it were, we have an agreement that gets us out?
Well, there's a process point here. The European Union have been clear that the talks will start with issues around our leaving the Union and will progress to talking about the future. But it is clearly very much on our agenda, and we set it out in the Article 50 letter, that as soon as possible we will start talking about implementation phases so that we can be clear to business, to investors, that there will not be a cliff edge. And by the way, the cliff edge works both ways. This isn't just about British businesses, German businesses, French farmers. None of them want a cliff edge. They all want time to adapt to whatever changes we have to make.
Do you think it's possible to have a cross-party agreement on the nature of Brexit?
I don't know, because I don't know what the Labour Party's position on this is.
But you're obviously not opposed to...
Well, I have always thought that we should now try to get a deal which commands the widest possible support.
Sadly, I've got to wind you up. It's incredibly annoying because so much more to talk about.
Now, Theresa May's authority was already in freefall even before her faltering handling of the appalling disaster at the Grenfell Tower in London. Yesterday, she admitted that the official response had not been good enough. But can she now get a grip? This morning's front pages, as well as reflecting the full horror of that tragedy, are also full of claims that her critics are circling and ready to pounce, though none as yet have come out and said so publicly. The Chancellor Philip Hammond was on the Andrew Marr show and was asked how long the Prime Minister has now got.
I think what the country needs now is a period of calm while we get on with the job in hand. We've got some very serious issues to address, including the Brexit negotiations just starting. Theresa is leading the government, and I think the government needs to get on with its job. And do you know what? I think actually that's what most people in this country will think, that the government just needs to get on with the day job of government.
Get on with the day job, Tom Newton-Dunn. Is that what they're saying in private?
Some are certainly wanting her to go. There's definitely chat in the bars. I had lunch with the Minister on Thursday who said we need to get this thing sorted now, because if we go on like this with this Prime Minister without any power at all, we're going to end up in a John Major situation. It will only get worse for us. But just talking to the people I've been talking to this week, I don't think that's the predominant view. The predominant view seems to be she has to stay for the time being, at least till conference, and possibly as far as the end of the Brexit negotiations. The reason being, there is no real alternative. There is no obvious person who could come in. And also, the last thing they want to do now is have an unbelievably divisive leadership contest, rip up the very, very thin consensus that currently still exists on Brexit, and go back to square one.
Journalists around London are now searching for who Tom Newton-Dunn had lunch with on Thursday. Thank you for that. Julia, is that sustainable in public, though, with a Prime Minister whose authority was already, as I said, in free fall, and now is clearly clearly not handled this disaster well.
Yeah, exactly. If you go back to the 1922 committee meeting, everyone thought, oh, do you know what? Oh, she handled that really well. She's obviously, you know, she can actually do this stuff. If only she did this in public. Yeah, I mean, it was just astoundingly poorly handled, practically and PR-wise. But that's the question: is she even physically, mentally, character-wise, is she capable of changing and behaving in a different way? Her selling point, her USP when she ran for the leadership was, you know, I'm not clubbable, I don't sit and gossip, I don't do emotion, I'm just going to get on steady as she goes. Well, it's not been steady as she goes, and she hasn't got on with it. And so if you don't have the sort of touchy-feely Blair or Cameron stuff, and you don't have strong and stable, then you're kind of left with nothing. But I agree with Tom. It's not that people want her, they just don't want the alternative.
Steve Richards, as someone who's done these magisterial broadcasts about prime ministers of the past, you have studied and you've lived through many of this. It can't possibly go on, but go on, it often does.
Nearly always it goes on and on, for lots of reasons. One being a fear of an early election, when MPs think we're going to lose our seats, so we must stop that from happening. A fear of a leadership contest in which by some freakish sequence they elect another dud. All kinds of things mean that quite often, 74 to 79, Gordon Brown, after the non-election 2007, had faced about 8 internal coups. He survived a lot of them. Now, this is a slightly different context because it's a hung parliament where she has just lost an overall majority. And I think there are questions about whether she herself is ready for the mountainous, daunting ascent to come.
But one of the reasons that Gordon Brown succeeded and carried on, Steve, was that other people, the Alan Johnson, the David Miliband's, concluded they might not be better at the big job in hand than the economic crisis. Is there a chance that now, for all the criticism of her, that people say, you know what, she's the best we've got to handle Brexit?
Well, they want her to carry the can for Brexit. I mean, that's the thing. They want her to carry the can for everything. No one wants to take on the leadership, whether it's Boris Johnson, David Davis or anyone else, unless they can ride up on their white steed and save the day and then possibly call an election.
There's also the point a lot of Tories are making is that Brexit is not going to be the most beautiful of experiences. There are going to be some compromises, a bit of pain. And a lot of people are thinking, well, get her to sign the £50 billion cheque, possibly higher, possibly lower. Someone else can come in on a white horse and save the day.
Now, bets by journalists are not a clever thing to do, but I'm going to
stop doing that.
Are you all saying, because I think you are, that you think she's going to survive for some time?
I think she will survive for some time. I'm not sure how long, nobody is. And it's interesting that Philip Hammond didn't answer the question because he doesn't know either. But I think she will for some time.
A week ago on this show, I said that I thought there'd be an election this autumn. I now think all bets are off. I like to say I didn't make a prediction for the election outcome, so I didn't get it wrong. I didn't get it right either.
Very wise, Tom.
Cowardly. If she doesn't screw up very badly, which I think this week has been, then I think she will probably last till the end of Brexit.
Tom, Julia, Steve, for the moment, thank you very much indeed.